let's look at two examples that I'm going to bring up. The first one is very, very simplistic, but still it gives food for thought, right? Let's look at a simple two-dimensional. I'm going to use examples from mathematics because it's something I'm a little bit comfortable with. I hope you can follow me down that road. Anyway, let's look at a very simple two-dimensional object, a square, a sheet of paper, say, for example, right? Now, we can observe that in order for that object to exist, you might need to postulate something larger than that. And that is where the analogy lies with your text and context. You're saying you've got your bit of meaning there, but it makes no sense unless you can place it in a larger context. Similarly, a little two-dimensional square in a mathematical world can't just exist by itself. A little two-dimensional object, if it's finite, like a square, needs to sit into something bigger than itself. For example, the square, if it's perfectly two-dimensional, must then necessarily exist in an infinite plane. Or, if we want to remove the boundaries to that square, so we want to have something that's finite but has no boundaries, the only solution, apparently, is to fold that square in on itself and fold it around like this first into a tube, then take the tube, fold it around and connect the two ends together, and you're getting basically something that looks like a donut. But again, that square then, or that two-dimensional object, then exists in something bigger because it had to be bent in a third dimension, which is therefore the larger context, to refer back to the analogy. But it is not as straightforward as that in mathematics, because it is actually possible to dispense of anything larger. And that's where the discipline of topology comes in. Look at our little square again. Perfectly flat, so no third dimension required. But we now introduce a couple of rules. And the rules are very simple. You take an object that exists within the little two-dimensional square. But we say it can move around within that square, but it's limited to the space inside the square, obviously, because the square is a finite entity. But when it reaches the top edge, it's not really an edge, because basically what happens is, as it carries on upwards to the top edge, and it would, by the looks of it, get out of the little square, it actually immediately reappears at the bottom. So the top edge is defined as being identical to the bottom edge. Similarly, the right edge is defined as being identical to the left edge. Now obviously, intuitively, that makes no sense at all. But in mathematics, that's the point. In an abstract mathematical sense, there is nothing prohibiting you from doing this. And what that means then is that your square has actually got no real boundaries, because the edges that we've used to draw our little square are just abstractions. It's like you're looking at something through the viewfinder of a camera, which then creates its own edges around it, where in actual fact no edges exist. And what you can do to illustrate that is you can shift the viewport on your square, and you'll see how the bottom half of the square flips with the top half and the right one. So you'll see that you're actually just panning within that same space, but you're panning around, and something that seemed to be approaching the edge is suddenly in the middle again. I hope you can picture that visually, because it's a bit hard to get your head around. But what the important thing about that is that we've suddenly got something that, according to the field of topology, is called a torus. It is called a donut, but it's two-dimensional, it's flat, It does not require any expansion beyond its own size, and it doesn't require any extra dimensions. So it's self-contained. It's completely self-contained. It does not need anything outside. So coming back to meaning, and I'm not saying this is the case, but I'm saying we can't dismiss this as impossible. We could have a self-contained set of knowledge base, that is sufficiently complex that it allows for it to be self-contained, and there needs to be nothing outside that knowledge base. Maybe. We can't dismiss it as impossible, I don't think. But here's a more complex example of something similar to that. Now, this refers me back to your bumper sticker example, the no Jesus, no peace example. And what I find wrong with that example is that it appears to be too simplistic, because it's a single statement, completely taken out of context. Yes, context, text and context, and then becomes meaningless, or you can't derive the meaning of it. But what if we looked at a whole set of statements, a whole complex of statements, a web of meaning, a web of knowledge? And this is where I go back to a second analogy, and again it's an analogy to do with mathematics, and this time I'm going to throw in the name of Kurt Gödel. Because Kurt Gödel showed that a sufficiently complex mathematical system can be sufficient to describe itself. It needs to be consistent, it needs to be complete, as he called it, but it can describe itself. So it does not require anything outside its own set of symbols and operators in order to describe itself. So you don't necessarily need something that's bigger. Yes, it does lead to what are called Gödel statements, statements that can be created, that seem to fit the system, but of which the truth or falsehood cannot be derived. But that is the mathematical system, and it doesn't make the system any less complete either, or less consistent. And again, I think that maybe text, context and meaning as a whole could be part of a system like that, even if it's not in the mathematical realm, but in a more kind of conceptual realm. But something that is self-contained, complete and consistent, and therefore does not require anything outside of itself. Think about that.